Hello and welcome to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will finally be doing my more casual review of the Chronicles of Pern by Anne McCaffrey. Before I start anything else, a quick disclaimer. It is a review of the Chronicles of Pern as a series. I did not, however, read all of the books in that series. I only read, actually 9 books in total, but I recently reread 8 of them. Well, 7 rereads and 1 new read. So it's a review of a third of the Chronicles of Pern, since that series has a total of 23 books in it, which were written between 1967 and 2012, and 8 of those books were written by either Anne McCaffrey and one of her sons, Todd McCaffrey, or just by Todd McCaffrey after his mother had passed away. That being said, I still think my general impressions hold for the Chronicles of Pern, the general ideas, themes, world-building elements, etc. But, keep that in mind. I don't know every single thing about it since I haven't read every single word on every single page in every single book. I will give a brief idea of what those books are about, the type of story. So the Chronicles of Pern are a big science fiction series with a very special feature in them, dragons, which are usually associated with fantasy. But I wouldn't even call the Chronicles of Pern science fantasy. It really is science fiction, and it's fairly hard in certain respects. But they have dragons. Dragons are an alien animal species, which is very cool. I think that is a very original idea, and I will always give points to Anne McCaffrey just for that alone. So, you have human beings who basically colonized the planet Pern, which is a planet orbiting a star called Rukbat or Rukbat, and they live in it's not quite a feudal society. I don't think that's an actually accurate description. You have holds with, tenants, farmers who tithe to a lord holder. And then you also have guild halls for different various types of crafts. And then you have weirs in which reside dragon riders, this special feature of Pern. And dragon riders on Pern have a very specific job. It's to protect the planet and its inhabitants from an alien life form that periodically rains down upon the planet called Thread. And Thread is a type of mycorrhizoid, is the way she describes it, so somewhat fungal in nature, but I never found that name very accurate or meaningful in a way. That's not what I would imagine a fungal organism to be like. Whatever. And it comes from outer space, from an Oort cloud, which is space debris, I think, basically. And so it rains down upon Pern in cycles of 40 to 50 years, every 250 years, more or less. And the human beings who colonized this planet came up with the dragons, and I'll get back to that specific element, came up with the dragons as a way to fight the thread. Burn it to a crisp, because unfortunately if the thread reaches the ground, it eats everything, consumes everything. If it touches you on your skin, you'll have 3rd degree acid burns, which are very difficult to heal. If it goes into the ground, it just consumes every type of life form it comes into contact with before dying off. That's the general premise for the entire series. Of course, I'll go into details with regards to the progression of the main story arc, but that gives you the basic idea. So the way I'm going to do this casual review, I'm going to fall into my usual pattern of talking about the writing, the themes, the characters. But of course, I'm not going to delve too deep into any one specific book because we're going to be here for hours. I will try and keep spoilers to a minimum. Mostly, I will be spoiler-free for 3/4 of the video. And when I'm going to start talking about world building, I'm going to start spoiling a bit more liberally, but I'll give you adequate warning. I'll also have a little note about problematic bits in the books at the end, but I'll also provide timestamps in the video description. I think that's fair because I do tend to make longer videos and some people might only be interested in specific bits of it. Alright, so writing-wise. The writing was never anything that special to me. It's pretty standard sci-fi fare, I would say. At times it definitely has that classic older science fiction vibe to it. At times it gets very technical and harder in its scientific elements, but I think that's a good thing. I don't mind that. I appreciate that, in fact. Some of the descriptions she gives of the bonds between human and dragon, and we'll get back to that, are some of these stronger bits of writing, actually, because they're really touching descriptions, and she gets a bit more poetic about it to really convey how deep of an emotional impact it has on the human being who is lucky enough to bond with a dragon. It's alright, really. The writing is alright. It's nothing special. It's nothing too bad either, in a way. It did the job, basically. The Chronicles of Pern are, as the name suggests, chronicles, which means that each book in the series doesn't necessarily follow each other, chronologically. That's the whole thing, actually, like, in what order should I read the Pern books? Should I read it by publication order, by chronological order? And you can find information on that on the internet. A lot of people recommend publication order. Despite them being chronicles, though, you can separate some of the books into small subgroups with specific story arcs, though I would argue there is one big main story arc that takes up most of the books, and most of the 8 books I personally read. You've got the first trilogy, which comprises Dragonflight, Dragon Quest, and the White Dragon. You have what is called the Harper Hall trilogy, which comprises Dragon Song, Dragon Singer, and Dragon Drums. I have never read Dragon Drums, and I didn't this time around either. And it's considered like the YA Pern Chronicles. I do think that's a later characterization for marketing purposes. But having reread them, yeah, I could see that it's probably meant for younger readers because it's very simplistic in its tone and themes. Not that there's anything intrinsically wrong with that, mind you. It's just not the kind of thing I look for in books nowadays. And then you have, like, what I call the OG Pern story, which is Dragon's Dawn, which explains how Pern was colonized by Terrans and how they first had to deal with dread, which was something they hadn't expected at all based on the surveys which had made them determine they were going to colonize Pern. And then you have like the 2 concluding titles, which in a way still fit within the story arc present in the first trilogy and in the Harper Hall trilogy, and also kind of follows from information you get from Dragon's Dawn, and those are All the Weirs of Pern and The Skies of Pern. And all those fit into a major story arc. Still, you could technically read some of these books as standalones. And surprisingly enough, the types of stories you find in each of those books is pretty similar. The only 2 that I would say stand out more are the Harper Hall books, because that's clearly a coming-of-age story, a story about a young person, a young woman, finding her place in the world. But the basic formula tends to be the society of Pern is facing a big problem. And then a couple of characters, a couple of main protagonists, stumble upon a solution, discover a solution, and they're going to make sure that everyone gets on board with that solution. I'm saying this in a bit of a glib tone of voice. Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It does get a bit repetitive over 8 books, though. There are even some, plot devices that get reused. I realized this as I was reading the very last book, The Skies of Pern, which is, chronologically speaking, the conclusions of the series, even though there are Chronicles of Pern books published after that one. And I was like, I've seen this before. Isn't that a wee bit convenient? Really? You're going to do that again? And I think it's important to note, because I distinctly remember that the main reason I got tired of the books back when I was 11, 12, 13 is because it got a bit repetitive, a wee bit boring. There wasn't additional original material being brought in. There was a lack of freshness. Things like that. That being said, one of the things I did enjoy about the books is that most of them have multiple character perspectives, and I really do enjoy that in fiction. I've recently realized this, but this is something I tend to really, really appreciate. Character-wise, there are many characters, so I'm not really going to go into any one of them with any depth. What I will say is that one thing I liked about the Chronicles of Pern is that each new book manages to introduce new characters whilst also propping up and keeping you in touch with characters from the previous books, especially if they're what I will call main characters for the overarching story. So characters like Lesser, Flar, or Jackson, Manali, Robinton, the Master Harper. Those are characters you will find in most of the books that form the main narrative. And it's nice to see how some of these characters evolve over several years, even decades, to see them as very young people and then as older, more mature individuals. That being said, I don't think her character work is that good overall. So I'm not sure if this is a function of the fact I didn't read every single book in the series, but I found myself confused several times by jumps in character evolution. I was like, this character was like this in that book, and now they're like a completely different person. Some of it might be put on the account of age, the fact that people mature with age, ideally, and they can change and either, reject some characteristics or get confirmed in them. But at times I thought it was really a violent contrast, and I was like, I didn't see the character build-up. None of this makes sense to me, and I'm not entirely sure it's entirely due to the fact that I might have missed some books in between the books I did reread. Examples include a character called Miriam, and she's a young woman who becomes a dragon rider, and this is weird for reasons I'll get back to in a minute. You've got Jackson, who is a bit of an asshole, a tool, in his main introductory book, which is The White Dragon, because he has a white dragon named Ruth, who is adorable, by the way. He's a sweetie. I loved Ruth. Jackson, not so much. He's very entitled in a way. That's the weird thing. As a kid, he's like pretty shy, not that confident. And then he's a young teenager and he becomes very whiny and complains about the fact he can't really be a Lord Holder because he's meant to be a Lord Holder. And he can't really be a dragon rider because that was kind of an accident that he impressed a dragon. And you're like, oh yeah, poor you, your life is so miserable, get over it. By that I mean that his life is not miserable. It's like he's got an awesome dragon companion. He's said to be sort of a noble. They're not really nobility, but I'll leave that for now. Why are you complaining so much? And even lesser, I guess that was less of a problem, but she's like the main character in Dragonflight. She becomes a weird woman, so that means she bonds with a queen dragon, and queen dragons are like at the top of the dragon hierarchy. The way that species works is quite weird, but I'll get back to that. It seems like she becomes increasingly more vindictive or petty with her age. And again, I can see the seeds of that in her character in Dragonflight, but I don't know, the way it evolved didn't seem that natural. That being said, she also has good qualities. She's fierce, brave, has a lot of determination, good traits. So, I mean, it all makes for a disjointed feeling overall, which I did not enjoy. That being said, one thing I do find interesting about this series is that there is no big bad person, antagonist. You do have people who are more bad, more malintentioned, more selfish, things like that, or power hungry. You definitely have those human attributes present in some of the Pernese characters, don't get me wrong, but there is no big antagonist. The antagonizing factor, presence, entity, is Thread, which I think is different. It's a bit different. It goes back to the theme I will talk about in the theme section of kind of human versus nature in a way. The enemy of the Pernese is Thread. It's such a fundamental existential threat to their continued survival on the planet of Pern that I guess in a way they don't have too much time to really form dictatorships or big kingdoms that war with one another. Because I said it's science fiction, but the main society of Pern during the main storyline, you have to realize takes place like 2 millennia after the original colonization of the planet, and it has significantly devolved, technologically speaking. So you would perhaps expect like fiefdoms and mini countries warring with one another, but that just doesn't really happen. I mean, you have a bit of an exception in Dragonflight where one Lord Holder gets a bit greedy and starts accumulating other holds, but then that doesn't really last. And I think that's partly due to the fact they have this big enemy which isn't malevolent, isn't evil, it's a mindless organism from space that just falls down on them. But they have to unite in a way to, make sure they survive on the planet of Pern via the Dragon Riders. So that, I think, was a good idea, an interesting idea, an original one. But yeah, I mean, the characterization is a bit inconsistent, I guess. It's not overall bad. It's not overall good either. It's a bit fluctuating in a way. I think there was good characterization in Dragon's Dawn. Some characters really stand out, like Robinton, the Master Harper, is also a very genuinely good character. But yeah, it's just not consistent. theme-wise. So keep in mind, I'm going to mention a few things here. I do think they're very much present in the books to a certain extent, but they're not explored with that much depth. So I think the main one, based on the books I've read in any case, is adapting to change on an individual level, sure, but more specifically, adapting to change as a society. Because if one thing consistently keeps happening on Pern is massive global change, whether it's the original colonizers discovering that there's this weird life form raining down upon them to kill them, basically, and they have to scramble to find a solution to that and adapt their way of life or their planned way of life to that. Or the main storyline, which starts off with people realizing that thread will be falling upon them again, because I said thread falls every 250 years, more or less. Well, sometimes intervals last longer than that. Sometimes it's 400 years. And so people forget that thread is even a thing. And so when you start Dragonfight, you realize that the Pernese don't even believe that thread will be coming back. But some do, most notably the Dragon Riders, and they're trying to prepare everyone for that. So they have to change as a society to face that threat. And then by the time you get to all the layers of Pern, you realize that, oh well, we might have a permanent solution for thread, and they start rediscovering some of the ancient tech of their colonizing ancestors. And well, they realized that they had colonizing ancestors from another planet, and so that presents a whole slew of potential changes to their way of life, their technology levels, etc. So that's very much a recurring theme, adapting to massive change as a society. And I mean massive change. Now, the second main theme, in my opinion, of course, is that of human versus nature, and also, in a way, human in cooperation with nature. This is, of course, exemplified by thread. Thread, which poses an existential threat to humans colonizing Pern, and then down the line, humans just living on Pern. It's what makes it interesting and original in a way, because like I said, there isn't any one main human antagonist. It's mindless organisms raining down from space. And humans trying to come to terms with that, basically. Now, within that, I think you could add the sub-themes of humans trying to survive in the wilderness. That's kind of what happens when the humans come to Pern for the first time. They have to settle down on this planet and build stuff and make a life for themselves and, exploit natural resources, set up, water mills, farming stations, power plants, etc. And they also, manipulate some of the existing nature. Because, they are spacefaring humans. They do have advanced technology, even though they have the express intent of not being a super highly technological society, because they associate that with wars, which characterize, the societies they left back on Earth and a couple of other planetary systems that are mentioned in Dragon's Dawn. So they do want some of the amenities of high technology, but they try to keep it to a debatable minimum. So they have things like bioengineering and DNA manipulation to a limited extent. Yeah, they manipulate a life form to create dragons down the line, so that's a major thing. So you can already see some aspect of the exploitation of nature that humans are very well known for. And it's actually, I think, debatable whether is it humans cooperating with nature or humans exploiting nature to fight nature in the form of thread. Because so the fire lizards, which are like miniature dragons from which dragons are created, seem to be very friendly towards humans. And they also have like telepathic dolphins that accompany them, and they're all just so eager to help out humans, no fear whatsoever, which is nice, but perhaps a bit naive in a way. Like, it's very convenient for the humans, and in a way the animals are getting perhaps not outright exploited, because I don't think that's what's happening, but it's also the benefit of the humans is my point. Like, what are the fire lizards actually getting out of it? What are the dolphins actually getting out of it? I do believe in friendships between humans and non-humans, obviously. Like, I'm not against having pets or anything like that, but I think it's not unreasonable to examine that with a bit of a more critical eye. So now I will be giving my official warning. I will be going more deeply into the world building itself, and I might spoil some elements which you only learn about in like Dragon's Dawn after 5 novels in the Chronicles of Pern. So sorry about that, but I want to be able to speak freely about the world building because it's something that I find very interesting. So like I said, the main draw for me was obviously the dragons. The dragons in the Chronicles of Pern, a science fiction series, are an alien animal species that were bioengineered from fire lizards. There are several species on Pern which are 6-limbed. So these are not, Song of Ice and Fire dragons, wyvern types. They're like traditional Western dragons with 4 legs, hind legs, and wings going, from the shoulder joints. But they started off as being fire lizards, which are like, I guess this big they're supposed to be. So about the size of a velociraptor, I guess. And there are other animals on Pern which also have 6 limbs. They have a kind of snake-type creature. They have wherries which have feathers. And there is a bit of genuine hard biology going on there because she talks about the evolution of some species from an original species that was oceanic. So that's cool. I like that. And you can look up, dragon biology in the Dragon Lover's Companion to Pern on the internet. The way they produce fire, for example, is chewing on phosphine-bearing rock. It goes into a specialized stomach and gets regurgitated as flammable gas. So she definitely put thought into creating these dragons to be somewhat realistic. Now, some authors in fantasy try to make their dragons more realistic by just having them be wyvern-typed, is what I call them. So they just have 2 legs and 2 wings, which are their arms, like a bat or a bird. That's what George R. R. Martin did with his dragons in The Song of Ice and Fire. But she went the traditional dragon route, but tried to make it work because it's an alien species on an alien planet with different kinds of chemical composition to the DNA structure and the minerals present in their bones, things like that, which is very cool. So Penny's life isn't carbon-based. It's like boron and silicon-based. I'll give her that. That is good sci-fi world building. Even the thread is described in harder sci-fi tones with the microscopic structure and the way it reproduces, etc. I will say though, it's not perfect. I still had questions about how dragon anatomy works and things like that. So you also have to know, dragons can teleport. This is very important because the colonizers of Pern realized that these little fire lizards burn thread naturally in their natural setting every time it falls down on them. And then just at the moment where they might get hit by a thread, they pop out of existence, seemingly, and then reappear somewhere else. And they realize they can teleport. And this process is even described because, human beings end up being riders to the dragons, which are bioengineered. And they describe it as going between, and between is this void where you don't feel anything, and thankfully it only lasts about 8 seconds, but it's terrifying the first time it happens to you. You just go into nothingness, and then reappear in the physical universe. So they can teleport, and obviously they have telepathic abilities because they communicate with their riders. They speak to their riders, with words. And they even have names. Now, that's something that never gets explained. When the first dragons hatch out of the first eggs, bioengineered from fire lizards, they pop out and say, "My name is this." I'm like, but why? How? Why? The fire lizards don't seem to have names, and suddenly these dragons all have names that end with the letters TH, by the way, so Ramoth, Nementh, Golanth, Path, Ruth. I'm like, where does that come from? Alright, just roll with it, I suppose. And so they can talk to the riders. Now, it is explained that this is actually enhanced with their bioengineering technology. The fire lizards are more empathetic, so you can share emotions and you can feel their emotions if they're angry, scared, happy, content, etc. And then that gets developed into actual telepathic abilities where they can talk in their minds with one another. Now, dragons also have this interesting mechanism of impression, which is present in some earth animals, like geese. So if a gosling hatches and sees you, it kind of fixates on you as its parent, which is useful in conservation efforts, actually, because it allows human beings to raise endangered species and teach them to fly, etc. So that's how fire lizards and dragons function. When they hatch, they don't just impress upon any human. Again, I'm not really sure how that works, but when they find their human, they look into one another's eyes and boom. Love at first sight, literally, but I mean deep, soul-shattering love and bonding, to the point where if a dragon dies prematurely, the rider will more often than not commit suicide out of sheer despair. And if the rider dies, the dragon automatically commits suicide, which is pretty tragic. But this isn't always the case. In fact, there are 2 secondary characters in the book that survive the death of their dragon and go on to lead quite productive and meaningful lives, so good for them. It also means that the emotional bond entails some weird mechanics surrounding sex. This leads me to another point. So the fire lizards and then the dragons have a very weird societal structure to their species. At first I thought, what's a bit like bees? And it's not really like bees either. So you have these different colored dragons. You have the queens and the greens. The queens are golden and the greens are green. And they are female. And then you have male fire lizards and dragons, which can be either blue, brown, or bronze. The queen is at the head of the tribe pack. I mean, what do you call a group of dragons? The fire lizards are called fares. The groups of fire lizards are called fares. Okay, fine. And the queen lays the next generation, basically. The greens can also lay eggs, but more often than not, they get eaten by predators. And I'm not really sure, like, how that will get selected for ultimately. So that to me was a weaker point. What's the point of having a female that lays eggs that are never going to hatch? I don't really get that. And so the males, the lower tier males, like the blues, and sometimes the browns will mate with the greens. But then the golden queens are very uppity and selective, and they'll only mate with bronzes. Perhaps the odd brown. And so the whole structure of weirs is based off of that. The leaders of weirs are riders of bronze dragons and golden queens. And so that ties back into a very weird mechanic around sex. Since humans feel the emotions of their fire lizards, and even more so of the dragons they are bonded with, when dragons go into their mating flights, because that's how they reproduce, the female goes into heat, flies off, and then basically any bronze who fancies her has to chase after her, and the one who catches her gets to do the nasty with her. And the randiness gets communicated to the riders, and to just cannot help but have sex together. It's weird. Some people get very bothered by this and even say that it's rape by default. Personally, I don't think that. No, I'm going to get back to that subject, by the way, but that specifically to me does not really read as rape, because in a way, both the male and the female humans can't really help themselves in a way, I guess? It's super weird though. So they're basically overcome with the lust of the dragon, so they have to bone with the rider of the dragon their dragon mates with. Now, keep in mind that Chinese society is very sexist in a way, or at least for a while. So that did not make sense to me, but riders of golden queens are always women. The riders of female greens are men up until like the last 2 books, when women start becoming riders of greens. And apparently at the beginning of the history of Pern, women would also be riders of greens. So I don't even know how that shifted over time. It's never really explained. Like, there's a character called Miriam who just, you learn that she's impressed a green dragon. I'm like, but how? Since when? Like, it was an accident, but they just roll with it. But before that, they were prejudiced against that happening. So again, shaky world building there. I'm like, so if you've got 2 men who are bonded to like a blue or a brown dragon and a green dragon, and they get overcome with lust, don't they have sex together? No, apparently they just all stand in a room together and do what? They jerk off as a group? I mean, that again, that's never really explained. Now, I have read somewhere that Anne McCaffrey was a bit homophobic or something, so maybe that's why she didn't really touch that. But I'm like, again, commit to your world building, mate, is my point. I would have gone there, like, make it logically consistent. Now, society-wise, like I said, it's not really feudal. You have holds. Holds are headed by lords or ladies. This starts changing towards the latter books, and they have farmers living on their lands, and you have a tithing system. It is a hereditary position, but it has to be approved by council, so semi-hereditary, so it's nobility light, I guess. You have craft halls, which are like medieval guild halls, with an apprentice, journeyman, master system where you can learn a specific craft. And the craft usually, encompasses different skills that are related. One of the most important ones is the harper hall. Now, harpers are musicians, but they also act as record keepers, teachers, dispute settlers, and, communicators for spreading information throughout Pern. and it's very important to the story. One of the main characters is a master harper, Robinson, so it's hugely essential to Pernese society. And then you have the Weirs, which are the places where the dragon riders live. And all of these three entities are independent. You cannot control a craft hall if you're a lord holder or if you're a Weir leader, though sometimes they do try to influence things because humans be humans, am I right? Those are, I think, the main positives. The way technology is described and the way, contemporary Pernese put words onto the ancient tech they rediscovered. That was interesting, calling astronomy, star smithing. That was cool. But despite that, I think there's severe limitations to the world building overall. One thing I found very weird is the lack of historical depth or historical awareness. Granted, you've got about 2,500 years that passed between the initial colonization of Pern and the start of Dragonflight. But that they've lost their awareness of coming from another planet so completely is a bit weird to me, because they are aware of other historical events, and at different times they say, well, we had these weird records that were going to shreds that seemed to imply we came from the stars. So there's conflicting information present in the books. So did you know or did you not? Because the harpers say some of their songs hint at that. That was never clear. There's also a lack of cultural depth overall. Pernese society is oddly homogenous in a way. Now, I said the fact that threat falls on them every 250 years for about 40 to 50 years might partly explain that, because, they have to unite to fight thread. But still, there are suggestions that there are different accents for the different regions. But I don't know, to be that culturally homogenous over a fairly large swath of land seemed a bit weird to me. And finally, the thing that really bugged me the most is the complete and utter absence of religion, or even just spirituality and folklore to go with that. I do not believe that, especially if they have devolved, technologically speaking, have forgotten that they come from another planet, they're all atheists by default. I don't buy that. That does not make sense, knowing what we know about human nature and the way our brains function, etc., especially if they have freaking dragons in their everyday lives, which is pretty insane and incredible and magical in a way, even though, like I said, this is science fiction. I don't buy that it would be so one-dimensional in a way. It doesn't even have to be religion or organized religion, but just a spiritual sense. Even in Ursula Le Guin's book, Always Coming Home, which talks about a post-apocalyptic society that has a very low level of tech that has gone back to a kind of anarcho-primitivist society. They don't have religion, but they have a type of spirituality which is a bit akin to animism. I would expect something in Pern, not just this complete lack of anything to do with faith, spirituality, folklore. That to me is a big aspect of world building I think she completely avoided, intentionally, unintentionally, I don't know. So add to that the lack of cultural depth and the lack of historical depth. I don't actually think the world building is that good overall, actually, except in those little aspects of native life forms or the societal structure, things like that. And now, the most controversial bit about my review. I'm going to address the sexism question. I have seen some people on Reddit, on Goodreads, complain about the characterization of female characters, about the sexist elements, about the rapey stuff that happens in the books, which I agree with. And some people reply to that, well, for the time, Anne McCaffrey was groundbreaking. She was feminist. She put so many female characters in leadership positions in her story, etc., etc. All right, let's address this. No, I do not think that Anne McCaffrey was being feminist in these books. I cannot speak to her personal life. I did not know the woman. I haven't read much about Anne McCaffrey as a person, so I will not speculate on it. Yes, there are a lot of female characters. There are even a couple who are good, compelling female characters. One of them is Manoli in, the Harper Hall trilogy, which is also present in, later books. And someone like Lessa is a very important protagonist in Dragonflight and Dragon Quest, even though her achievements kind of get, appropriated by a male character, but whatever, doesn't matter. And, yes, they are in leadership positions. And towards the later books, there are improvements, I will give that. The structure of Penny Society is changing. Females are allowed to be green dragon riders and, lady holders, and are admitted to craft halls, which they hadn't been previously. So they become apprentices, journeywomen, and they call them masters, but you know what I mean. So there is female representation. Yes. And it's not the worst female characterization I've come across. I wouldn't call it misogynistic by any means. I would call it a bit sexist, however, because Penny Society is sexist. Again, nothing I'm saying has to be taken as reflecting the author. I know nothing about the author as a person. I'm not accusing her of anything. I'm talking about the text here. I don't think Anne McCaffrey should get a feminist medal for the Chronicles of Pern, especially given the other female science fiction writers which shared her time period and wrote actual feminist fiction, like Ursula K. Le Guin, because Penny Society is sexist, and what annoyed me about it is that it's never explained as to why. Because in Dragon's Dawn, humans seem relatively egalitarian. I mean, there are annoying characterizations, like the woman who's hypersexual is the bitch in the story and the traitor. So, like the seductress trope, alright, fine, put that aside. I can live with that, no problem. But overall humans are egalitarian. Like, you've got female admirals and spaceship drivers. But then it devolved back into sexism for some reason. I don't mind if there is sexism in a society you put in one of your fictional worlds. That's the thing. There is sexism in Westeros in A Song of Ice and Fire, but there are characters in Westeros which fight against that, and there's an examination of gender dynamics and the mechanisms of sexism. I would say A Song of Ice and Fire is a feminist story, by the way. Not at all, and it doesn't have to be. I'm just saying it's not unreasonable to say there are feminist or feminist-adjacent elements in the novels. In Pern, it's never really explained why it's like that. Why can't women be harpers? What's the justification for that? I guess you can have a sexist society, but give a reason for it. Examine that. Just talk about it. Don't just assume that's normal, natural. If you want to get a medal for, she was this feminist writer and she was so ahead of her time when she wrote those books. No, that's not good enough. And just having decent female characters is it's really the bare minimum. I'm going to take something from mathematics here. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition to brand it as feminist or super bloody progressive, especially considering the cringy ass sex stuff in those books, which I'll get back to in a second. So please, no, Anne McCaffrey did not write a feminist series when she wrote The Chronicles of Pern. Also, another thing, can we please start with the argument, it was written in the 60s and people didn't know any better. This series spans about 50 years. She had time to get significantly better, at least, like in the 80s, and she doesn't get that significantly better. A little bit, but not that much. And I'm sorry, but this feminist second wave was going strong in the 60s and 70s, and additionally, like I said, there were feminist science fiction writers at the time. So that is not a good enough excuse. I'm sorry, can we please stop with that argument? If it was written in the 1920s, okay, I could agree with that. 60s, 70s, 80s? Sorry, no, it's not a good enough argument. Right, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the rape to love trope. Because, yes, this is present in those books. You know how hate to love is a thing? Well, meet its cringy sibling, rape to love. Because that happens several times. And like I said, I'm not even talking about the weird dragon rider lust mechanics, which is weird, but doesn't actually bother me on an ethical level. The riders can't really consent, but both can't really consent. I don't really think they're raping each other when they're having sex like that. That's just a weird position to take. It is weird. I'll grant you it's uncomfortable, sure, but I don't think it's that problematic in and of itself. What's problematic is having characters which are in fact raped, and then it's totally fine, brushed aside, and then they fall in love with their rapist. Like Lessa and Fla, which are the two main characters of Dragonflight and Dragon Quest, start off their relationship with rape. Now, they start off their relationship with the mating flight. Okay, that's one thing. But then they feel obliged to be a couple, and Fla outright admits that, I really hate the situation, the sex we're having is so cool, and I hate that I have to keep raping her. So I'm like, well then, why? You could just stop, asshole. What is that? Yeah, that was weird. I mean, there's some questionable mechanics around consent and abuse of power with Jackson and the White Dragon, but that was not quite as bad. But then even in Dragon's Dawn, you have a woman drugging a man she fancies, so he'll finally have sex with her. Because yeah, I mean, the rape even goes into the reverse position of a woman taking advantage of a man. And I don't care that it was just an aphrodisiac. If it's a chemical substance that affects your physiological or mental response, it is called a drug. Ergo, she drugged him. And he has sex with her, they get married and have children, and it's just as she's about to die that he realizes, I really love this woman. That is some effed up dynamics. Like, what the heck? Why does she write her relationships like this? It's super... And then in the Skies of Pern, when I thought we were past this crap, you have Phelessin, the son of Fla and Lesser, who initiates a relationship with Tai, one of these new Green Dragon riders, female Green Dragon riders. And Tai has experienced basically a gang rape of sorts during her female's mating flight. Because when green dragons go into heat, first of all, they're described as very wanton, and this whole thing about that just, again, bugged me slightly. All the males who chase after her, traditionally, the human riders, like I said, go into a room all together, but usually they were all men, and conveniently enough, of course, the men never did anything between themselves, right? Right. But this time you have a female green rider, and I guess she was in the room with all those randy men, and so I'll let you picture what happened next. And so she's basically traumatized by this, which is, yeah, understandable. And so, as it so happens, her dragon gets very attached to Phelessin's dragon. And finally, the green dragon goes into heat, and Phelessin's a bronze dragon. That's a bit unusual. The bronze goes after the green. And Tai is absolutely terrified because she realizes that the dragon lust is about to fall upon her. And Phelessin realizes this as well, and he's trying to convince her to choose him. So instead of like doing the right thing and locking himself up in a room and locking her in a room so they don't have to have sex together, no, he just goes along with it like, we're going to have sex together, but I don't want her to be traumatized by that. I want her to choose me. And so they have sex together, and she even sheds a tear, and I'm like, all right. But then magically, of course, his dick made everything better. I'm being a bit crude here, but come on. Like, the sex was tender and loving, and they end up being a couple, and I'm like, oh god, can we just stop with this? Can we please just stop? And that book, I'm sorry, it was published in 2001. Again, do not at me with the, it was written in the 1960s, people thought differently. Screw that. I was not a stan of that by any means. I mean, yes, like I said, the weird mechanics around sex and the dragons mating flights is not a problem in and of itself. But I mean, like, if a dragon rider can actually survive their dragons dying, surely you can have enough self-control that you do not go into dragon lust and have sex with the other person. Like, I don't buy that for a single second. That did not need to happen. Certainly not that way. So yeah, I'm not going to give a bloody feminist stamp of approval, cookie, medal, what have you, to Anne McCaffrey for having the bare minimum of decent female representation, of having alright female characters, and for having a weird fetish for absence of consent and rape to love tropes. For fuck's sake! No! If you actually want feminist science fiction, it exists. You don't have to want that, by the way. I don't think, let's be clear here, I don't think a book needs to be feminist to be good, by the way. Not by any means. So I'm not saying the Chronicles of Pern are bad. I'm not saying they're bad, for one thing. I'm not saying it's bad that they're not feminist. I'm just saying I vehemently disagree, as you can tell, with the assertion that Anne McCaffrey was being feminist for her time, and as such, you're a stupid snowflake if you complain about the obvious sexism and weird rape crap present in her books. Nope. Sorry. So, in conclusion, I don't think those books have aged that well, most notably because of those problematic trademark elements, though, as you can see, I do think there are flaws in other respects. The overall characterization, the plot holes, the disappointing ending of The Skies of Pern, that's its own thing. The not that great world building overall. Some bits of the world building are very, very good. But overall, I think there are major gaps in the world building and also the repetitive aspects of some of the plot devices and some of, well, the plot elements, period. And yeah, I am surprised I overlooked the cringy, rapey, sexist elements back when I was much younger. I was younger, sure, but I was sure that it would have bothered me even then. I don't think I will be rereading this series in the future. I think I'm just gonna let it lie. Like I said in my monthly wrap-up, I'm gonna keep them in my library. I think they do retain a special place, if only for the dragons. The dragons and the bonds they have with their riders are very special. A lot of the dragons are just good. They're fundamentally good. Like, they never hurt humans. Never. They're never used for warfare or anything like that. There's something very gentle about them, even though they're ginormous carnivores. That's something that sometimes I had a bit of an issue with. The size of the dragons, like the sheer hugeness of them isn't that believable, actually. If you think about it for a minute, they're actually too big in a way. Like, imagine a flying T-Rex. A dragon from Pern would be bigger than that. I'm like, does that actually work, like, with regards to biological physics? I don't think so. But anyway, the dragons are very special. Like I said, Ruth, even though Jackson was kind of an asshole, Ruth was adorable and cute and so well-intentioned, and you really want to have a dragon of your own, or even just a fire lizard, which is more manageable given their smaller size. I mean, I think I joked in a previous video that my go-to fancy pets are like Velociraptor or fire lizard, basically. But yeah, I mean, I don't think I'll be reading these books in the future. They have a special place, but they really haven't aged that well, and they're not that good. Honestly, I don't think it's that good of a series. The writing is alright, the characterization is inconsistent, it's good in some places, it's not so good in others. The world building is very good for some of its specific elements and honestly lackluster in others. The stories do get a bit repetitive and follow a set pattern overall, I think. Even though the main arc is somewhat compelling, sure. And then you have those problematic aspects that just have not aged well at all. Overall, and again, keep in mind that I've only read a third of the series, technically speaking, I would say the Chronicles of Pern hovers between a 6 and a 7 for me, and not higher than that, honestly. Some books are like 7, 7.5, and then some books are like between 5 and 6. So overall, averaging it out, I would say, yeah, 6.5. So that's that. I mean, it's not bad. A 6, 6.5, 7, 6.5, I think I'm going to stick with that. It isn't bad. It's not that good either. So if you haven't read these, if you're an adult, I don't really see much of the point. I feel there's a strong nostalgia factor to being a fan of the Chronicles of Pern or having a fondness for them, like I did, and I guess I still do in a way. Most of the comments I've seen on the internet are people who read them as children or young teens. And then when they reread them as adults, they're like, yeah, no, it wasn't that good, was it? Unless you're like a hardcore dragon lover, and I can 100% respect that, I wouldn't really strongly recommend you pick these up, honestly. I think there's much better science fiction out there, that's for sure, and there's certainly much better fantasy if you want to get your dragon fix through there. Lots of stuff out there. There's no shortage of dragon literature, am I right? It was a fun experience overall. I'm glad I reread them. I'm certainly glad I finally read The Skies of Pern and officially concluded the series. So I do not regret rereading these books by any means. It was overall enjoyable despite the very cringy elements. So, have you read the Chronicles of Pern? Were you interested? Are you interested in reading the Chronicles of Pern? Please do share your thoughts and impressions. Now I'll be getting back to shorter fiction, though sticking with science fiction for the most part. And the next big reread I'll be having, like I mentioned in my previous video, is His Dark Materials, for which I'm very, very excited. And of course I'll be doing a review of His Dark Materials in August. In the meantime, I hope you're all doing well. I wish you all a lovely day, evening, night, whichever. And I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye!